Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor where today I'm actually going to be doing a little bit of sewing. I know, no one is more surprised than me, and even the sewing took longer than I expected, so maybe that's just something about this house. I'm not quite sure. But even though I haven't been able to make any clothes for a very long while, I still have been, of course, browsing Pinterest, and this late 1930s dress had caught my eye. No surprise there, really, seeing as it's tone on tone, black on black. It's kind of texture blocked is usually what I like to call this, as opposed to color blocking. You could, of course, use two different colors, but I will be using two different textures of black fabric to go ahead and create this dress today. And while I ended up not quite having enough fabric to do the little bow at the neckline, I'll have to grab some more from Mood so I can add that on later. I wanted to make it removable anyway, so it's something I can add on as long as they don't sell out of that fabric. Luckily, it was otherwise easy to replicate the design details of this dress if it did mean a little bit more of a complex sewing process than I personally kind of like getting into, but you'll see what I mean. So for the very first time from here in my new sewing parlor, let's go ahead and dive on in. And we begin with a piece of alphanumeric paper and my basic bodice block pattern, and I have done a little sketch of this design just to keep me on track as I work through the pattern drafting. To me, it looks like they are controlling the dartfulness in an angled dart from the side seam at the waist to the apex. I decided that instead of a dart, I would just make that a full style line, continue it all the way to the center front. And I did add on a satin cuff sort of accent to the sleeve as well, just because I thought that would go well with the rest of the design. And while this does seem to have a side zipper, seeing as there's nothing indicated along the center back here, seeing as there is a center back seam for the skirt, I might as well just extend that up to the neckline and do my usual center back zipper, because we all know I hate a side zipper. I'm not doing it. But here I am making a tracing of the front of my basic bodice block, and I will go ahead and extend my darts all the way to the apex so that I can move that dart fullness around. And I do have a 1/2 inch of seam allowance along the center front of this as well, because this bodice design does seem to have a center front seam. And I have to kind of decide exactly where these style lines are going to fall. The first style line will kind of become a princess seam. It's not a usual princess seam, but technically it will be controlling the fullness. And before I draw those in, I'll just go ahead and modify this neckline. I wish I had brought it out just a tiny bit further along the shoulder, but I'll get into that sometime soon. But I did bring it down to a slight, very tall V-neck here in the front. And then I had to decide where I wanted this first style line, the one that was a dart in the original design, I think, but I just wanted to extend it all the way to the center front. Just drawing that in here. It's sort of a obtuse angle, like so, instead of a very straight line. And I will go ahead and cut up the waist dart to the apex and cut where I want the dart fullness to go along the center front here. Close this up like so and tape that dart fullness away. You can see that that dart fullness has moved up here into the center front. I'll do the same here along the side. This does work if you have only one dart as well, by the way. I'm just closing two so you can get an idea exactly where that dart fullness is going. And I could use these as darts, and you can see this is my total dart fullness for my particular body shape. And in fact, you can just measure this angle to know it in the back of your mind what you particularly need for your body. Mine happens to be 51 degrees. That's how much of a cone I need to make my bodice into to fit around my particular shape. We'll get into the math of darts a little bit more later on in a whole separate video, of course. But I just pulled these apart where they were still slightly connected with the sinew at the apex there, and I'm just going to add seam allowance on to create a style line here instead. So again, this is sort of like a princess seam, but this is not like a traditional princess seam. Usually princess seams go up into the shoulder or into the arm side. But obviously here we're going from side seam into the center front. So it's more of a horizontal princess seam, which I do quite like actually. And I forgot to draw in my notches as usual. I always forget, so here I am doing that afterwards in Sharpie so that I can have a marker that goes over the Scotch tape. I'm always using washable markers over Scotch tape and it doesn't stick. So I just end up with ink all over my hands instead, so that's not really ideal. But here we have my notches. We have my princess seamed style lined, aka bodice. And you can see exactly where that dart fullness has gone. But I do need to add on the other stripe here up into the neckline. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to draw a curved line which will look quite straight on the body. Hopefully this will make sense at the end. If you've ever watched my Blade Runner dress video, which is a much older video where I make, again, several mistakes. If you want to see me humble myself over and over again, watch this video and then go watch the Blade Runner dress video, where I also do some stripes that look curved in the pattern but look more straight on the body. Hopefully that makes sense. And here you can see the first seam is controlling the dart fullness. It goes to the apex. This one does not go through a pivot point like that. So I'm just adding the second style line only for style reasons, not for fit reasons. But I still do need to put on seam allowance before I can sew this back together. This is only here for, I guess, color blocking reasons. I'll just label these real fast, make sure the grain line is still consistent. That's kind of the nice thing about grid paper, is that you can see the original grid and see where your grain line would have been if you were cutting it with the center front parallel to the grain. Like so. And so now I have my front bodice, and I can set this slightly aside and start working on the back. I just wanted to indicate to myself to make sure I didn't bring anything too close to the center back, because I know I'm going to be putting a center back zipper in there. I was just zooming in on the design on Pinterest to kind of see what they had done. They have a kind of strange princess seamed back that, in my opinion, would be hard to control the fit just using that alone. It would just be an annoying curve to sew, because it would be almost a right angle of a curve. So I'm going to modify what they had done just a bit here. So I'm just going to grab my front piece and see where that met up at the side seam. Unfortunately, I should have double checked this and I didn't, which you'll see later on in the sewing process. One of many small mistakes that add up to an imperfect project this time. I'm going to draw a style line that goes through the dart pivot point once again. We don't have the apex here on the back. It's a much subtler curve for the back compared to the bust, but we do still have to keep this dart in mind. So one of these style lines has to contain our fit. This one down here on the side is just going to be for style reasons, and then this one through the center here will be where I eliminate the dart fullness once again. And anytime you color block like this, you do need to add your seam allowance back in. Anytime you cut the pattern apart and are planning to sew it back together, you have to, of course, add seam allowance. But here I am thinking, I can just close this dart. Of course, I have to cut everything apart before that will happen, but I was just looking at the stripes here and seeing how wide I wanted to make them. So it's kind of guesstimating what that would look like in fabric later on. So I decided to move this around just a tiny bit, modify that before I cut it apart. But I will go ahead and finalize this style line here with the scissors, tape my dart closed, and then again add seam allowance. And you can see where that dart fullness on the back has gone as well. This is why I prefer a slightly darker table, because against the white paper you can see what's going on, I feel like so. And once again, I need to add seam allowance to all of this, so let me just go ahead and do that, and I'll get back to you shortly. Alright, like so. Seam allowance, so these can be sewn all back together. That's where the dart fullness went, and here are our back pieces. In 3, just like the front. Seemed to make sense to me. And I had forgotten to trace facings for the front before I cut it apart, so I'll go ahead and make 2.5 inch wide facings for both the front and back neckline. Now, this would have been a great plan if I ended up using the facings, but in the end, due to other reasons, I ended up having to line this bodice, even though that was not my original plan. So here I am making facing patterns, but alas, in the end, I will not use them. It's a long video. It's a journey today. This project was a journey. It took me a long time to put this dress together, partially because of little mistakes I made along the way, and partially because my cats. But you'll see them interject later on. Now for the skirt here, this does seem to have an A-line skirt. It seems to be quite full, or like a full A-line skirt. So I'll go ahead and take my skirt block pattern, make a tracing of the front here, draw in the darts as usual, and then to make this into an A-line skirt pattern, all I need to do is draw a line from the dart point to the hem from each of the dart points, and then close those darts, basically slashing and spreading those darts closed at the waist and open at the hem to turn this into an A-line skirt. Many of you will have seen my A-line skirt video where I talk about how to make this pattern in more detail, so if you'd like to check that out, I can link it in a card above. And this is the kind of visually understandable way of doing this, but there is actually a much easier and less wasteful way to do this, so I'll do that for the back. The magic method I will do on the back here. But for now, let's just go ahead and cut this apart, cut down my dart legs, and then close those darts, which shifts that angle in the other direction towards the hem, where of course it has a much longer distance to travel and therefore opens up a lot more. The angle is the same, the distance changes. Again, there's math going on here that I don't even personally quite understand, but hopefully you can see it happening. If geometry class was more about pattern drafting, I might have enjoyed it more. Now I'm going to go ahead and draw in the shape of yoke that I want here onto my A-line skirt, and then we can go ahead and make this have its gores as well. The yoke does seem to have a straight line to the center front and then a slight curve up into the hips, so that's what I tried to mimic here. Once again, anytime I separate into style lines, I do need seam allowance, so I'll add that back on. This will be fun to sew later. There's nothing quite like sewing convex and concave curves and points together, and I'll be doing a lot of it today, so we'll get tons of practice in. All right, seam allowance on my front yoke and on the skirt front itself. Now I just need to go ahead and separate this into the two pieces. Again, there's no particular reason to add this seam here. It is just for style reasons to make this into a gored skirt instead. You could add a little bit more flare in here if you wanted to, but it's not really typical for the 1930s or early 1940s. Like this dress, I think it said it was from 39. So there wouldn't be extra fullness being added in here, really. That was more of a 50s thing to go really extra with the fullness of the skirt. Here in the late 30s, early 40s, less so. But once I've added the style line in here, once again, I will add seam allowance to that. And this does not actually have this detailing either the yoke or the gores in the back of the skirt. It just shows a two-part back of the skirt in the illustration. But I will be adding a little bit more detail just to match the front a bit better. And once again, I'm doing the magic method for creating an A-line skirt back here, which is where you trace the first, like 4 inches up to the first dart, basically. Put an awl in that dart point. Keep tracing up to the next dart, put the awl in the next dart, and again, turn the pattern. Again, I explain this in more detail and do this a little bit more slowly in the A-line skirt video, so check that out if you'd like to see what the heck I just did. But basically, this skips the slashing and the spreading, all the cutting and extra tape and paper involved, especially when I'm going to be doing this as one piece anyway. And I won't even be goring this later, so eh. But I will go ahead and use the front to help me draw in my yoke for the back here. So it's the same along the side seam. And I will cut this out and cut the yoke apart and again add seam allowance. And again, I'm not going to be adding the gore seam line in the back here, so it will just be one piece for the lower part of the skirt back here, although it does still have the center back seam where of course I'll be putting my zipper, and they just had a center back seam in their skirt. A lot of times in older designs like 30s and 40s designs, fabric came in narrower widths back then, so a lot of times there are gores in the skirts that we don't necessarily need to have. Again, they're not there for fit reasons always, or even style reasons. They're just there for necessity because of the width of fabrics. And now fabrics are always 45 to 60 inches wide, whereas in the past I don't think they had access to wide width apparel fabric the same way. So I think that is part of the reason that there are so many gored, like paneled skirts in the past when they don't even need to be paneled. Now I will be modifying my standard block sleeve here to have a slight leg of mutton, bit of puff at the top here. These do seem to be a pleated leg of mutton sleeve, so that's what I'll be doing here today. I do think I was a bit conservative on the amount of puff I added though. I think I could have gone harder and that I should have. So another thing that is just like a little tiny detail that I wish I would have been paying closer attention, but this is my first project back after quite a break. But I have just squared off a line 3 inches down from the underarm, and here I am just drawing some lines across the center of the sleeve here, along the center of the sleeve. 2 lines, 1 an inch out from the center on either side, and then another 1.5 inches out from there. And I will use those to split this open and add in the fullness at the top of the sleeve. I do want to narrow this just a tiny bit along the side as well, at least 6 inches down from the underarm seam so I'm not interacting with the bicep. So I can go ahead and narrow this just a tiny bit, about a 1/2 inch on the back here, and only about 1/4 on the front, really. Just a slight bit slimmer. I am taking 1.5 inches off the hem though, because my sleeve pattern is super, super long. Even this is usually not enough. Past me made it that way. I don't know why. Now I will go ahead and cut down my first 2 pleat lines, or what will become pleats later on, so I can hinge open my sleeve. Once again, when I'm like slashing and spreading things, I'm just cutting to like the hinge point and leaving a tiny bit of paper so that I can hinge this open however I like. And I will just draw a new center line on a piece of paper so I can tee that off, tape this down, line everything up, and I'll cut down these other 2 lines. I'm going to move this up 2 inches here, and this is where I should have added like at least 3, if not 4 inches of fullness. So you can see this little crescent that's sort of being added in the center of the sleeve across the bicep here. I really should have raised this a little bit further. I only did 2 inches here. That center square in the center of your screen, it's only 2 inches. I should have raised this at least 3, if not 4. But of course I can only say that now, later on. I will raise this sleeve cap like so, but it's just an indication of the curve that I will need because I will go ahead and pleat these. If you were gathering this instead of pleating it, you could just go ahead and leave that smooth like that. But I'm going to go ahead and pleat the paper closed and then trim off the excess so I have the correct shape along my sleeve cap here. Just making these pleats go away from the center line. Hopefully that makes sense. Down towards the underarm on either side, I guess. Like so, so that when this is pleated later in fabric, I have the correct shape up here along the sleeve cap. Hopefully that made sense. I've been doing a lot of leg and mutton sleeves for the last year or so, so you've probably seen me do several different methods for those at this point. This one is on the the sort of gentler side compared to some of the larger ones. But this isn't the 1890s, this is the 1930s. So, fair enough. And then I will go ahead and draw in my little peaked cuff as well. Again, just mirroring the yokes and other details on the rest of the bodice. So I'll just cut this apart and again add seam allowance. And I just left my elbow dart right where it usually is. I'll sew that in as normal. And while I'll be using a rayon-based satin as the sort of accent fabric for this texture blocking dress today, the main body of the rest of this is going to be in a wool twill suiting fabric, almost a gabardine sort of fabric that I picked up from Fashion Fabrics Club. I don't think the exact suiting is available anymore, but they do tend to have some nice suitings for very inexpensive prices over there sometimes, so I feel like they're a good place to go bargain hunting. And luckily, unlike the satin, the wool sewed perfectly fine and behaved very well compared to everything else. So I'm glad that I still have a few yards left over. I can make another dress in the future out of course, a black wool suiting. Can't go wrong there for me. I live in a cold-ish place and I love black clothes, so. But here I am cutting out my satin pieces, trying to keep those on the correct grain line here. And I had a tiny bit left over here, as you can see, after cutting everything out once. I ended up cutting out the cuffs twice and then these yokes for the skirt twice. That way I could interline them in the same exact satin. That's why I didn't have enough to make the bow, but this was more important to me to interline these, give this fabric a little more structure, but without having it be different. And you'll see that interlining these with the same fabric was the right choice, and what I decided to do on the bodice, where I didn't have these extra pieces, was the wrong one, but you'll see what I mean later. And by the time I got to cutting out the wool, my supervisors had woken up from their naps, so I had a few extra guests in the sewing parlor. This little gray tabby is Oliver, by the way, and he's like a miniature little gray tabby. He's particularly miniature when you compare him with Xander, who is my orange tabby and is a big boy. I was just marking in my elbow darts on my sleeves here, and I will go ahead and mark where I need to pleat the sleeve caps as well. Of course, I need to mark the pleats on the front and the darts on the inside, so important things to remember. You don't want your pleats on the wrong side of the sleeve cap. I mean, you can do it, it just won't look as planned, I suppose. Just getting these to behave, and I was thinking, why isn't this behaving? I almost played around in the paper again because I was second-guessing myself. No, you did this part correct. It's other stuff that you'll mess up later on. Don't worry. I am using some glass-headed pins here from Little House, I think is the company. They're Japanese pins. I can link these below. They're my current favorite pins, and I'm using a new system for pinning now that I have a sewing room that is frequented by cats, and that is to keep them in this lidded box. So I have the lid on these when I'm not using them, and it's a glass box that's kind of heavy that can't bat around. And also I have counted out 22 pins. So throughout the day, I can keep track of how many pins I have and know if any are missing and check the floor for them and make sure they haven't ended up anywhere where the cats can get to them, because I don't want them playing with pins, and you'll see that they are tempted by the whole idea later in this video. But I'll pin the pleats along my sleeve cap into place, and I'll go ahead and baste these into place since I'll be at the machine sewing my darts anyhow. And yes, again, I had my new intern here, Oliver, helping me out, making sure things had fur on them. Goodness. And for my little tiny elbow darts, as always, I'll start on the large end of the dart and sew off the tip and then tie the two pieces of thread shut. You don't want to pull too tightly, just gently down to the surface of the fabric. Tie that off a few times to make sure nothing's going anywhere. You can also do back stitching. I had to learn several different methods back in fashion school. This was just the one that I have stuck with since. And again, here I've just turned the machine up to its largest stitch length so I can go ahead and baste those pleats into place along my sleeve cap. And I'll press my elbow dart using my tailor's ham and a little bit of steam over here in this nice wool fabric, like so. And I will start stitching my satin sleeve cuff detail onto the end of these. I'm just going to go ahead and use this little tiny chalk pencil thing. This is from Clover. I usually use colored pencils here in the sewing room, but I decided to give this little guy a try and actually quite like it so far. So that's been a nice little upgrade. And I'm just using that to mark the seam allowance along the point of this so that I can see exactly where I need to leave my needle down, clip and turn this when I'm over on the machine in a moment, which I will walk you through. But I'm just going to pin the first side of this, making sure that point is matched up with where it needs to be on the underside. Hopefully this makes sense. I'm hoping that you can see what I'm doing. Of course, this is the first video I've filmed here in the new studio with new lights and with big windows, where I'm used to filming in a basement where I have complete control over the light, aka had blocked all the natural light. And here, there's plenty of natural light, which means it changes throughout the day as the sun moves and as clouds move around, and from day to day things are different. So to say that lighting in this house is becoming quite the issue. So do forgive me if some of this is a real mess when it comes to lighting today. I'm working on it. I gave myself a nice challenge with black on black to start with here. Oof. But basically I just sew along to the point, leave the needle down in the exact point that I marked in the chalk, bring the presser foot up and snip down in the like obtuse side, the convex side I suppose, and then I will go ahead and start pinning the rest of this, put my presser foot back down, and then keep sewing my seam here, careful not to get any tucks or weirdness going on at the point. Is this the easiest thing to do ever? No, especially in rayon satin that wants to move around. Not cool. But again, for some reason I decided instead of a nice simple project to jump back into it, I would do this. I will go ahead and take this over to the ironing board here and give this a nice press. I actually figured out as I went along here that it was easiest when combining these two fabrics to press the seam open and then press the seam allowance all together into where I wanted it. It just provided a smoother finish on the outside if I pressed the seam open first. Even if I was planning on pressing all the seam allowance into, say, the cuff or into a yoke later on, it was easier to press it open first. And it was a battle to not get iron shine on this rayon satin. This rayon satin feels very much like a 40s satin to me, so technically I think it was a good like period accurate choice to make, but it just wasn't very fun for me, you know? Not that I think a silk satin charmeuse would have behaved any better. I just don't like floopy fabrics, as we all know, which is why you don't see me do a lot of 30s things, but this is on the cusp of being a 40s thing, therefore I can almost get away with it. And I did have a little bit of a curve where this piece meets the underarm seam, so I did go ahead and put some clips in there, and then I'm just going to press all the seam allowance into the cuff itself, because I will be self-lining this cuff with a bit of the satin later, and none of the seam allowance will be seen. One sleeve ready, I'll set that aside and do the other the same exact way. Again, under the watchful eye of said intern. Back over here on the machine to do the other side. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance as per usual, black all-purpose Gutermann thread, and a standard universal needle. I don't even think I have a microtex in here. I think it's just a standard needle, size 12. Again, sew to the point. I did a little bit of backstitching in there. It's not necessary, but I get nervous. I'll come in here and clip, again, the convex side of this, turn everything to realign the other side of my point, put a few pins in here if I need to, and just keep sewing. Hopefully without getting a pucker at the point. But even I can't make promises, you know? Things happen. I do apologize if we have any extra weird road noise outside. To be fair, I'm just glad that the construction equipment that was preventing me from recording this voiceover has gone home for the day, because, oh my goodness, the incessant like beeping, like, you know when trucks beep when they're going in reverse? Just imagine that, but for hours at a time. Not particularly very fun. Have no idea what they're doing out there, can't see the truck, I can just hear it. So, I'm not going on a walk to find that. By the way, that little tortie who appeared for a moment there, her name is Sophie. She's my only lady cat. I have 2 boys and a little lady cat. So Lady Sophia is the kind of the queen of the place. Let's face it. And she's got that tortitude to match. And because I knew I wasn't going to be lining these sleeves, I decided to go ahead and do something for my underarm seam raw edges. So I decided to go ahead and bind those in some Hug Snug rayon seam binding, which of course to cats looks exactly like ribbon. And this is really where my troubles this day began, because you know, I had gotten quite a lot done until they woke up. I came down here and they were watching until I started playing with ribbon, and then they started wanting to participate. I just need to fold this or iron this Hug Snug in half to create a little like long taco to sandwich my raw edge in. And you can see here where the crime occurred. Unfortunately, Oliver just stole a pin right out of the rayon seam binding and tried to run away with it. Of course, a pin being basically a weapon. And I was extremely distressed by that, naturally. So as you can see, the interns got a little too rambunctious here and had to be placed in confinement upstairs. So I could actually attach my rayon seam binding along the raw edges, encasing the raw edges on either side of my sleeve here for both sleeves. And I did just machine stitch this, although some of the rayon seam binding I did for this project later on, I did just hand stitch. Kind of depends on how I'm feeling in the moment of which feels easier to me or which step in the process I am. So, and some of the decisions are made by me as I go along, and some are made by whether or not there's a cat invested at the time. So there's also that. So that's a new element in the process for sure. But with both raw edges encased in the rayon seam binding, I can go ahead and stitch this together. You can also stitch this first and put both raw edges into one rayon seam binding, but then you can't press it open. You do have to press it to the side, so it just depends on what you want to do there, which kind of depends on what textile you're using and how it's going to behave. I do have my little stuffed fake arm pressing tool inside the sleeve now, so I can press this open. And yes, my hands were cold, don't worry. This actually, it's not burning me, it's helping me out. Though as you can see, I do have the wood tailor's clapper nearby as well, for when I really want to press a seam properly as opposed to with my hands. And at this point, I need to go ahead and prep my, again, self-lining for the cuffs. So I'm just going to sew the underarm seam on these as well. That way I can slip them onto the cuffs, right sides together, and sew those along the end of the sleeve. But I'll press those open first. And because I was going to hand stitch these along the other edge, I did just go ahead and pre-press that other edge in that 1/2 inch, like so. It ended up not being enough because after I turned these cuffs inside, I could make the seam allowance a little bit wider. Hopefully that makes sense. Sometimes when you turn an edge to the seam, it eats up a little bit more fabric, so I needed a little bit more of a turn at the other edge. You'll see when we get to it. Here I am pinning those right sides together along the end of the sleeve, like so, and I'll stitch that over on the machine with difficulty as far as showing you. Clearly not the best camera angle I've ever chosen. What are you gonna do? And I will again use that funny little stuffed arm to press that seam open. And then I will do some edge stitching, or understitching I suppose, to hold this in place before I turn it inside properly and give it another press. I do live near quite a busy street. I'm off that street, or like my street adjoins that street down the road, but the busy street is quite loud, so if you can hear that in the background, A, you have great headphones, and B, I apologize. There is a really, really pretty house that's like bigger than mine and twice the price mine was, that is still for sale down on that busy street, but it's in like a really awkward spot, so I can see why it hasn't sold yet. And it's a beautiful Victorian house with some excellent details still inside, but it's just location, location, location down there. And here I am putting that understitching in here, turning everything to the inside like so. So now I'm on the inside of the sleeve, and I'm going to just pin this into place, covering up the seam allowance where I sewed on the original cuff, and just folding everything nicely so it's the right size, pinning that along the seam allowance from the first cuff, if that makes any sense, and I will hand stitch this into place. You could slip stitch this. I ended up felling it because, again, it's the inside of the garment. I don't care if it's a tiny, tiny bit puckered. It doesn't need to be perfectly smooth. No one will see it. That's right. And here's what the right side looks like. Of course, there's still pins in here, so it's a bit bubbly. But I'll finish this up by hand stitching this into place. And again, here I am just felling that. And you can see it's a new day. I'm here near the windows with all that light that I talked about earlier. So much daylight. In fact, some would say too much, and this shot is overexposed, which at least helps us see the detail of the black on black, but no details in my hands, which I guess, that's fine. This isn't my more detailed hand anyway. My left hand is the pretty one, with the tattoo on it. And one last press, and my sleeve is finished, ready to be set aside for now while I work on the rest of this garment. Why I decided to put the sleeves together first? No clue. But now it is time to start working on the skirt backs. So I will go ahead and stitch the yokes on in the same way I did the cuffs of the sleeves, basically. So I will pin and stitch the first half of the convex to concave pointed bits, for lack of a better term. Geometry people, tell me, convex and concave, but for angles as opposed to curves. Let me know. Once again, sew to the point, leave the needle down, pick the presser foot up, cut the larger side of this so that I can flip this over to where it needs to be, repin the other side, especially because the rayon wants to stretch more than the wool does. And by stretch, I don't mean the fabric is stretch, I mean that anywhere it interacts with bias, it gets a lot floopier. Hopefully you know what I mean. Or actually, hopefully you don't know what I mean, because you've never had to work with such a floopy fabric. And for that, I think is a better plan. If you would like to make something like this with a satin-looking accent, but without having to deal with a floopy charmeuse or something, use Duchess satin. It's about 1,000 times more expensive, but it will behave better. Duchess satin is like a bridal satin. It's like that thick satin, really traditional satin. Satin is a weave, not actually a textile, by the way. So like you can have a satin charmeuse, a satin-faced organza, a Duchess satin. These are different fabrics, different weights of textile that use a satin weave. So a satin weave can be done in many different ways and many different weights, with a crepe on the back, with double-faced satin, all kinds of different things. Obviously, this is a satin-faced rayon charmeuse, I would say. And you could have a silk satin, or a cotton sateen is actually a satin weave with cotton. They call it a sateen when it's not as shiny and pretty anymore. I think there's probably some subtle difference in the weave as well. Not quite positive on that one. I'm not actually a textile guru. I just play one on TV, literally. But with the backs out of the way, I can start working on the front where there is this gore seam as well, and a whole heck of a lot going on with our points here. This is like points on points on points. So once again, I'm going to use the same method to sew this. I'm going to attach the yoke to the centerpiece first here because I have to pivot at this very sharp, acute corner up here. And again, I'm just going to mark this in with my chalk pen and do my best to make sure everything comes out nice and pretty. Oof. And yes, this is rather a large pin dish for only 22 pins, but it is a brass, like moth, like flower and moth pin dish. I'm sure it's supposed to be like a candy dish or something. Probably from the 1960s or 70s. I picked up on Etsy sometime because sometimes I just type in moth, any like homewares, and see what happens. But I will sew this again in the same way, sewing to the point, leave the needle down. Doing a little bit of backstitching there just to reinforce it before I snip things, because I apparently trust myself at this point to do that without making a mess, which is nice. Bring that back down and start stitching the other side, again, hopefully without getting anything puckered and tucked. And I complain about this charmeuse, but honestly, it's one of the more well-behaved floopies that I've worked with. Not all floopy fabrics are the same amount of evil in my book. Some do behave a little bit better than others. But in general, I just like to not engage them whenever possible. I prefer a structured fabric, and a structured garment for that matter. All right, let's just give this a nice press over here. Again, I press those open first and then with a seam allowance up into the yoke, where I will cover it with, again, a self-facing, just like I did for the sleeves. But for now, I need to sew on the two side gores here. Once again, marking the point on the wool here, lining that up, sewing it along the top of the yoke first and then down the rest of the skirt. Again, using the same method that I've been using in this entire video. So if you wanted some examples of me doing this, yeah, got it. And I was reaching for my phone to change some of the lighting there because the sun is doing some interesting stuff. Oof. And over here, you can see this, if you look in the bottom, like left-hand corner, see how the lights are kind of striping like that? I'm sorry about that. That is just one of those LEDs mixing with frame rate problems that I do try and avoid. Press the seam open. This is actually a slight curve, so I'll put a couple of clips in here as well. Make sure everything lies nice and smooth, and then I'll press all the seam allowance up into the yoke, and then press the rest of the seam open. Because at this point I realized, I probably should have put the seam binding on this first, but I think there were cats nearby, and I didn't want to pull out the ribbon, as it were, and excite them, so I ended up doing that afterwards. I'll attach this other side as well, before I go ahead and do that. I do think this dress would look actually super girly in any other color, like in a baby blue or like a pink or even in an ivory. It would just look a lot more feminine, I think. Something about the black. It's one of those dresses that just looks quite noir to me. It gives like noir dame who's had 4 husbands and collected insurance on all of them, if you know what I mean. Especially with a like faux fur thrown in the mix. I want to look like a bad girl, a dame, as it were. And again, giving that a press. Is it behaving perfectly? no, floopy rayon charmeuse. Is it playing well enough? Yeah. And what did I tell you? As soon as you get the rayon seam binding out, it's like a summons for cats. And at this point, for some reason, Sophia decided that she wanted to attack the tailor's clapper. I don't know why. Maybe it's tasty. And of course, Oliver came to hang out as well, so I couldn't exactly move the skirt, so I decided to just go ahead and hand sew the seam binding on. I just did a running stitch to do that. Again, this is here not necessarily for structural purposes, it's just to keep that raw edge in check. And on a twill fabric like this, actually, there's not much worry. And because this is a dry clean only dress, being wool and rayon satin like this, it won't receive a lot of friction other than from my legs anyhow. And hypothetically, you'd be wearing a slip with this, right? Correct. But I was doing my due diligence, trying to make a garment that will last into the future by adding this rayon seam binding on. Trying to be couture about it, you know, even though, again, there are plenty of little tiny mistakes in this due to the textile and my mishaps. Which we'll really be getting into now. So here I am, using some fusible interfacing on the satin pieces for the bodice. I didn't have enough satin to interline these the same way that I had done for the skirt and for the sleeve. I wanted to give them a little bit more stability. I said, hey, I have this lightweight fusible, let's try it. It seemed to stick quite well, not perfectly, but it was making it feel more like Duchess satin as opposed to charmeuse. I thought it was going well. Things were going okay until they weren't. So, I'll show you that. Disaster did strike thanks to this, and it almost was a fatal flaw. So I'll show you what I mean later. Go ahead and start sewing my convex to concave curves. So different from earlier when we were doing those points and angles, right? Now we're doing curves. It's exciting. It's thrilling. It's not repetitive at all. Hopefully. I feel like you've seen me do curves more often because I sew princess seams all the time here. I do have a video all about princess seams, by the way. If you'd like to know more about using style lines for fit, I can link that in a card here if you haven't watched that video before. Because this is a curve, I will need to go ahead and clip this. I'll go ahead and clip triangles out of this so that everything lays nicely and smoothly, about every centimeter or so here, every ½ inch. Not to be all imperial versus metric here. Once again, I'm going to press this open and then press all the seam allowance in one direction afterwards, after everything is nice and smooth. As you can see, the satin is behaving perfectly fine right now with this interfacing. It's only when I start working on the fronts later that things get out of hand. Press that all into the main body of the garment, and I'm actually going to trim that down and then use the rayon seam binding to encase this raw edge along the inside as well, because I, again, wasn't planning on lining the bodice of this garment at this time. One of the reasons I don't always line things is I have a hard time finding black lining fabric, by the way. Good black lining fabric that isn't $24 a yard. Where art thou? If anyone has a really good source for black jacquard weave lining fabrics in rayon, let me know. Or acetate. I'm not that picky when it comes to my slightly wood pulp based thermoplastic fibers. But here I am just hand stitching the rayon seam binding onto this curve to encase that raw edge on the inside of my garment here. And this seemed to work just fine, but of course I didn't need to do it in the end because in the end I do end up using a lining. So this is a step I could have skipped, but who knew at the time? Who knew at the time? And now for the actual fit style line of the backs here. I will do this on either side as well, using quite a few of my 22 allotted pins. I did actually hit one of these pins with a needle, which is a rare occurrence, and it bent the pin, and the needle was fine, and nobody died. It does happen occasionally, though I do try and remove my pins and not sew over them anymore because I'm tired of hearing about it. But I bent one of the pins, and I put it aside, but then I forgot, so I counted my pins, and I only had 21 pins. And I thought, oh no, they've stolen one. Here comes the vet bills. I'm freaking out. Oh no, last night you bent a pin, and you threw it out. It took me a while to remember that. I had a good frantic 15 minutes before I remembered that I had thrown out one pin and I needed to replace it if I wanted to have 22 again. So I'm not saying that I'm not frazzled, I anticipate that this whole year will be a bit strange as I transition into living in this house all by myself with 3 kittens to take care of, or with 3 kittens taking care of me. They're not really kittens anymore, by the way. They're 3 years old, but eh. use some more of the Hug Snug rayon seam binding on this other style line back here as well. Again, just hand stitching that on, just to keep things nice and thin and smooth. And as you can see, Sophia was helping with my facings that I still thought I would be using. So let me go ahead and interface those. At least these were wool and the interfacing stuck no problem. We'll see how it did with the rayon in the front in just a moment here. All right, let me go ahead and just mark my notches for the front pieces here. The front 2 satin pieces, I suppose, for either side. So technically 4 pieces overall, left and right. Again, you can see where that dart fullness went. Let me line up my notches. I've just done those in pins here, as opposed to marking them with chalk or anything. Seeing as I was ready to go, ready to sew anyhow. I will line up this seam for both the left and the right, set it next to the machine, stitch that into place. It's a very easy princess seam to do this, because of course you can see it lines up quite well. So both sides are the same shape. You're not sewing a convex to concave curve. They are both convex and therefore line up no problem. Again, magic math is happening that I don't fully understand. I will go ahead and clip over the bust, especially this curve, so that this will lie nice and smooth on the other side. A first inkling while I was ironing this that this might not go smoothly, literally and figuratively. Press open that seam allowance. Of course, also, since I wasn't going to line this garment, this interfacing was going to hold the raw edges of the satin together as well. That's what I was thinking. So that I wouldn't have to do seam binding on these seams, especially over the bust, which would add too much bulk. But other problems did occur thanks to fusible. Fusible really is never the answer, let's face it, in a couture kind of application, which in life I do try and get better at sewing, or like more fancy about it, and therefore fusible really isn't the way. But there's so many different types of non-fusible that I don't really understand. I need a whole class about interfacings, which leads me back to needing tailoring training overall. Anyhow, let's go ahead and sew the last piece of the bodice on, the wool bit up here, the little wool bolero bit of this design, which actually is a very convex to concave curve, but luckily it's 2 different textiles, and the wool has plenty of stretch on this bias edge here. Still under the watchful eye of Mr. Oliver. This orange buddy's name is Xander, by the way. He's the most elusive. He's the big boy. He doesn't like jumping up onto tall things because he's got a lot to heave anywhere he goes, and therefore he doesn't like to jump up on the sewing table, which is great news for me. But it does mean that he will appear less frequently than the others. He will be a guest star as opposed to a reoccurring role like Sophie and Oliver. And I'll go ahead and clip that curve, press this seam open from either side. And you can see I'm using a piece of cotton here as a press cloth that matches it's funny enough, it actually is a piece of leftover ironing board cover. Could you tell? Yes, that's right. An extra piece of fabric here, just a piece of 100% cotton, just like muslin works well too as a press cloth. It's just a little rectangle here to keep at my side whenever I don't want to get iron shine on my satin, for example. And I will go ahead and pin the center seam of the left and right bodice. And this is where everything went to hell and back. I'll press that open, flip this over, and oh no, oh no. So the interfacing was like unsticking and resticking as I steamed and pressed this. And basically it was sticking the satin down to it in a wrinkly way. So it looked like elephant skin and terrible. So luckily there was a solution to this, which for a minute there I was just catastrophizing, obviously, which was to pull the interfacing off the back of the fabric and pull it out of every single stitch. So I could pull the big pieces off over here, but then I had to sit down and just pull all of the fuzzies out of every seam along the front. Thank goodness I didn't top stitch this, because then it would have been actually impossible. So yes, I frustratingly pulled all of the interfacing off of the rayon satin that I had put on, which was a waste of interfacing that I could have been used on some sort of a nice cotton project another time, and also just was a waste of time. Overall, a lot of time was lost, sadly. Part of the reason why this video is so late, but as you can see, without the interfacing on here, this does look a lot better on the outside, so at least it worked. That's all I can say. And you can see some of the interfacing fuzz is still stuck in this seam back here where I did bind the edge. So, the fusible interfacing was the wrong choice for this particular fabric. I should have just used a Duchess satin, but I didn't have any because I'm not a Rockefeller, sadly enough. Might be worth the splurge. Just grab 1 yard to have on hand. But at this point I could finally sew my shoulder seams and side seams, sew the bodice together properly. So I'll do those seams next, press those open again, have the tailor's clapper actually being put to use over here as opposed to being just attacked by Sophia. And for some reason this didn't line up along the side seam. Don't know what I did wrong in the pattern drafting there because I tried to mark it, but clearly I made a mistake. Luckily it looks kind of Art Deco to have it offset like that, but it definitely was not intentional. We'll pretend it was. It was totally my intent to have that be offset along the side seam. Don't be silly. Finally, I can find my sleeves that I made days beforehand and go ahead and set those in, matching up the shoulder seam to the center of the sleeve cap and the underarm seam to the side seam of the bodice itself. I'll just go ahead and set these sleeves in off camera because it's just a black hole void anyhow in these dark fabrics. Now at this point I decided I'm going to have to line this bodice because the satin is going to fray and it's just going to look nasty on the inside, so I better go ahead and do something. So I will tape parts of my pattern back together because I don't need to sew the style lines that are only there for design reasons, only the ones that are there for fit reasons. So I'll overlap the seam allowances and tape things back together. I didn't have enough of this black lining, part of the reason I didn't line this in the first place, but luckily I did have enough of this paisley burgundy and black rayon instead. I do prefer a jacquard lining, something like this that has a pattern woven into it, even if it's just a twill lining, some sort of a weave, other than a plain weave. Like a Bemberg rayon lining with a plain weave is, again, way too floopy. And the more there is going on in the weave, the easier the lining is to work with, in my experience. So I do prefer a patterned lining, not necessarily for design reasons, just for stability reasons. I'm just going to sew this together, following the similar steps as I did for the bodice itself, just with fewer style lines. And as you can see, Oliver was being very helpful during this process. Some would say that I bit off a little bit more than I should have with this project, and those people would be correct. But that's okay, I threw myself back into the deep end of it all. But I'm going to sew the side seams of my extra satin yokes here so that I can go ahead and do the same sort of process I did to the sleeve cuffs for the top of the skirt, for the skirt yokes, I suppose. So I'll sew the side seams there, and again, press a seam allowance into the other edge of this so that I can cover up my seam allowance on the inside of the skirt yoke with another satin yoke here. Makes it feel and look nice on the inside here. And just like I had earlier with the sleeve cuffs, I will hand stitch this extra piece of satin into place. And with everything arranged and pre-pressed, I can go ahead and put this into place along top of my yoke seam inside of the skirt. And again, I will just fell this into place and render things nice and clean on the inside of this skirt. And at this point, I will actually finish the neckline of the bodice by stitching the lining onto it, where I was planning on putting a facing, which would have been a whole lot easier in many ways. But I'll just go ahead and pin this. The only point of this that I really have to pay close attention to, other than lining up the shoulder seams, of course, is that center front V, especially because there is a center front seam in the bodice itself. So I just have to make sure I have the needle in the exact right place before I turn over on the machine. So I'll just have to be careful about that. One of the things that went well in this project, there's always so many areas where things can go wrong. But luckily, after the interfacing fiasco and trying to find a lining that I had enough of that I could actually line this bodice, after that, everything was pretty smooth sailing other than working around the kitties and their whims. Which, of course, now as I'm speaking to you, the cats aren't being chaotic at all. They're all asleep on my bed behind me. Lucky them. Alright, leave the needle down. lift the presser foot up and look inside of here. I actually grabbed my phone so I could use a flashlight to see if I was in exactly the right spot, because I needed to turn right on top of the center seam. Honestly, this would have been easier to do from the other side, but I pinned it in this direction, so here I am. And luckily, as soon as that lining was sewn on, it was sent to quality control, who did a thorough inspection, rolling around on top of the half-finished bodice. Thank you so much, Sophia. Let's go ahead and clip the V neckline and the curves of the neckline as well. I will then go ahead and give this a little bit of a press, a little bit of steam in here just to get things going, and I will do some understitching along the neckline as well, just so that it stays in place and the lining stays tucked to the inside where it belongs, especially because it's not the same color as the outside of the garment. This lining is from Mood Fabrics, and they do still, I think, have a little bit of it left, and they do these nice patterned linings, but they never do them in solid black. I'm just like, please, do black on black. That ants pattern one that you saw me try and use earlier for a brief second that I've used before, they did that one in black on black, but they haven't done another black on black since. And I'm like, help a girl out who makes black clothes, please. All right, lining is in. I'm actually going to roll that up and put it away for now. I'm just pinning the top of my yokes together here so that they don't move around as I sew them at the waistline to the rest of the bodice. So I'll line up the center fronts and the side seams first, pin everything else in between, and I can finally sew my bodice and skirt together. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual over here on the machine. All of the seam allowance will be tucked up into the lining and hidden away, so this will not be seen later. And because of the double layer of the yoke along the skirt, there is quite a lot going on here. Now I'll go ahead and clip this as it is a curve, and then press all the seam allowance up into the bodice, where again it will be hidden by the lining in a moment here. And I'm going to go ahead and put my center back zipper in here before I let the lining down. Place that into the wool. It's all wool along the center back. Thank goodness. Don't have to deal with any of that silly charmeuse or whatever it is. But I'm just going to fold that in its inch of seam allowance here that I usually leave myself. Press this edge into place and then pin it along the zipper tape. I am going to be sewing the first side of the zipper, the underside of the lapped zipper by machine, and then I will actually hand prick stitch the lapped side of the zipper. I do show this method in my zipper video, and I can link to that here because of course it's much easier to see what I'm doing in lighter colored fabric. But with my zipper in, I can let my lining down and stitch it into place and hand stitch it into place. So again, a little bit more time consuming work here. And I did pick up this little tiny ironing board recently because my new ironing board that I made here is ginormous, and obviously I can't really slip things over the corner of it like I would on a perhaps normal ironing board, so I had this little mini one when I need to get into tough corners like this. People, stop driving your motorcycles around. Please. Give a girl a break. I'm just going to press my seam allowance of the lining out of the way here, line this up along the zipper tape, and hide all the nastiness between the lining and the bodice itself. The good news is that once I am done doing this along the center back zipper and along the waist, then I then get to hand turn and stitch the arm size afterwards, so what a reward. But I didn't have enough lining to line the sleeves as well, which is a shame because this wool fabric, it's not particularly itchy, but it's not wool fabric, you know? Though I do have long-sleeved undershirts I could wear with this. Really slim little underlayers that Uniqlo used to do. I'm not sure if they're still doing them anymore. Used to have these like thin slate little undershirts that I really liked because it meant you'd have to dry clean your garments less. So I wish they would bring them back. Last time I checked, they don't have them anymore. It's really a bummer. I'm just, again, folding my seam allowance the way it needs to be for the lining. And pinning this to the seam allowance of the bodice itself, I will hand stitch that into place. Again, I just felled all of that, and then I get to do the curves of the arm side in that same way. Again, you have to be super careful when doing this that you're not pulling the lining in any which way, because in the end, if the grain of the lining and the grain of the garment are too offset, you will definitely notice when you're wearing the garment. And if you're doing this, always err on the side of the lining ending up a little bit too big. You would want the lining to have a little bit more room rather than the lining be smaller than the outside garment. Better that the lining floats inside the garment as opposed to the other way around, because you will definitely notice that the lining is pulling on the garment. And here I am actually slip stitching this area together. I think I felled the rest. Either works, it just depends on how smooth and invisible you want things to be. And I finally need to add some more of those vintage details. In this case, I'm going to use these early 20th century. I have no idea when these are from. Probably like late Edwardian or 1920s buttons here. A little bit early for the age of the garment. I didn't have matching wool-covered buttons to use down the front of this, so I went with some jet glass tiny buttons. I sewed all of those on off camera. Again, it took a while. There were many of them. I will go ahead and make the little matching belt shown in the illustration as well. So just have a 3-inch wide piece of the wool here. That's about, I don't know, 33, 34 inches long. A little bit longer than my waist, so I have room to play with. And I will sew that into a tube, turn that right side out, press everything. You can see I did use the fusible interfacing on this as well. Even though it had betrayed me earlier in the project, I knew it would work well for this, stiffening my belt. Pressing that seam open along the center of the back of my belt here. I'll turn the ends in on themselves, stitch those closed, and then stitch on a 1930s belt buckle that I had in my stash. The back of this is a little bit rusted, but no one needs to know, you know? And it was finally time to go ahead and hem my dress. I'm using some silk shantung bias to do this. This is 2-inch wide bias tape that is ironed into a single fold bias tape here that is 1 inch wide. I just do that by eye. I never even use those bias tapey thingies. I find it faster to do it by eye. But I will go ahead and sew that on, turn it to the inside, press everything, pin everything, and then finally finish this dress up by stitching this hem down by hand. Here is my finished wool and satin, sort of texture blocked late 1930s dress. Now there are certainly a few things I would fix about this in the next time, including not using that interfacing, of course, and maybe just not using rayon satin at all because it is just a bit of a nightmare. But actually one of the biggest things I want to fix about this is something I want to fix on all of my upcoming work, and that is that I want to make a small change to my block to make the shoulders sit a little bit better. Something is not going right up here, and I think it's that the neckline is actually too close to my neck. I'm not sure if my neck has gotten bigger over time. I certainly hope not, but it may be the case. You know, I am nearing 34 now, so it's a little bit different back from when I first kind of started working on this block back when I was probably 24, so things have certainly changed. So I do think I need to make a few adjustments to the shoulder line and to the neckline, so I'm going to do those on my block. I might film a very small little block update video. It will only be a few minutes long, but if you want to see how I would make those kinds of adjustments over time to my block, I think it's worth doing. So I'll definitely throw that up here on the channel when I hopefully remember to do that, because I have been meaning to make those changes for a while and I just keep forgetting, and it's really a bummer because that means my shoulders have that little wrinkle in it unless I stand up perfectly straight, which, while that would be ideal, is not something, unfortunately, that I can hold myself to. And despite the kitten chaos and other chaos while making this design today. I hope you still enjoyed seeing how this dress came together, and thank you as always for watching, and thank you so much to my patrons for making my work possible. And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.